Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you for our Storied Pilgrimage with Race. In this particular episode, we're going to be talking with Diane Cooley. And Diane comes to us from All Saints Cristo Rey in Watsonville. So Diane, it is a pleasure to be with you today. And I wanted to ask you a question. Your family, I think, has lived in the Watsonville area for a very long time. Where did they come from and how did they end up in Watsonville?
Well, my family, I have several sides of the family. I have my mother's side, who are from Berkeley, and they came from Missouri, and they came across from Virginia, Missouri, that path to California. And then my father's side came around the Horn and across the Isthmus. But they all came very early to California, and they came by each of the ways that people came to California, unless you were from Asia. And when they came here, they met a lot of wonderful people who had come up from the South, from Mexico. And there were people here who came across the Pacific from Asia, particularly from China at that time. But there were also people subsequently from the Philippines and from Japan. So I grew up with, I would call it extremely local, but extremely international in my idea of who is an American and what is an America? What is an American about? And I'm lucky in that regard, because I find that many of my friends and acquaintances and best beloved family who have spent all of their time in or their developmental time in one section of the country have a very different view of who is an American, who is a Californian, who is a Christian. And I guess that's why I'm talking to you, Bishop dear.
It raises an interesting question, and I'm going to go back first, which is, tell me, has your family's lived in Watsonville for 5 generations, I think you've told me? Is it 5?
Well, between Monterey, and then they came over to Watsonville, and then they were up in the Bay Area, others, but cumulatively, yes.
Long time, a very long time.
Well, I would say the probably the 4th and 5th generations would be my children and grandchildren.
Right.
But they're old now too.
So Diane, you know, a lot of people hear different terms to describe other people. So I wanted to ask you about certain terms. How do you, when you hear the word white, or you hear the word Anglo or Caucasian, how do you react to those terms?
I fit into all those terms.
If
Other people, I don't care what people, I care about people thinking that don't relate to them or that I'm a stranger. I am not anymore in control of how other people think of my skin color. If that's all they know or care about me, I can understand that. Not everyone has had the benefit that I have of traveling as widely or being as educated as broadly or loving as deeply as I have across all kinds of lines. I emphasize them all. I think that also your education has a lot to do with this. But I grew up playing with children of diverse ethnicities. It did not seem to, and some of them didn't, and their families didn't speak English. I grew up with children who did not speak English except I with them. And when you're making mud pies, it doesn't matter. It takes mud and water and happiness, which is the way we were all made. I hope God had as much fun making us as we had making mud pies when I was little.
That is a wonderful description, Diane. When you were growing up, so you talk about growing up around other kids, I assume this would have been in Watsonville. Is that right? Elementary?
I did not grow up around other kids. I had the rare opportunity, then not so rare, of growing up out in the country. I was an only child, and I mainly grew up with puppies, kittens, colts, calves, and a ranch hand or two, and a benign helper in the house for my mother and my parents. And then about once a month, I was scrubbed up and stuffed into a dress instead of the little jeans that I wore all the time, and whisked off to Berkeley and San Francisco to be with my grandmothers and great aunts and other and aunties and other family members and neighbors next door, and have a tricycle. What an amazing, here I had every kind of dog, horse, and everything all the time. But my idea of a big deal was to ride my tricycle all the way around the block. And be careful when you go down the hill at Channing Way, not to let your feet off the pedals, because they'd whirl around, you couldn't get your feet back on the pedals, which is a little metaphor for life. When you find that you're going on unusual terrain, you better keep your hands on the handlebars and your feet on the pedals.
So when did I mean, you're describing the difference between going to Berkeley, right? And riding a tricycle around the block and being on the ranch, which is very different, where a tricycle would not have been very convenient, right? When did you first start to come in contact with people that were not raised as you were on a ranch, and children of your age who were raised very differently from you?
I had wonderful cousins who lived in town, which is Watsonville, the big city, but they did not live. They thought it was amusing to have their little country cousin be. I was a lot more physical than they were. I mean, I'd run over and grab them, which they found a little bit overwhelming, even though they were older than I. And, but as I grew up, you ran over and you butted, little animals grabbed and butted and frolicked physically. Well, I got a little bit over that, as I got to be 5 or so. By the time I was in school, I became a little more civilized. I was taken into the big city, Watsonville, to go to school, because it was just as far to transport me out to the country school, which was in our vicinity. And the opportunities were very much more limited. There were very few children, many of whom, and they were from a variety of linguistic backgrounds. That I found that so I would have, as an English speaker, I would have had to kind of wait till everybody got the message from Tagalog or Japanese or Chinese or whatever it was. And I went to school in Watsonville. I went all the way through school, high school, in the Watsonville school systems, which were very good as far as I was concerned. I mean, I went on, I was accepted without any big difficulty whatsoever. I mean, I passed the test and was accepted at Stanford and went all the way through Stanford and graduated, you know, cum laude or whatever is a nice thing to do. And it didn't seem to have anything to do with where you went to school.
When did you become aware of issues around race when you were in school or anything like that? Do you remember at what point it became noticeable to you that you were white and other people were of different cultures? What did you notice about that?
I loved it. I grew up as the only white child in my immediate vicinity. Everybody else was Asian.
Mm.
And they were mostly Japanese. During World War II, which occurred when I was in middle school, and then went on through my high school, it was very sad because they were all shipped off, but it was a lucky, as it was explained to me, and it was true. It was a lucky thing because they were all those Yahoo rednecks that would have probably made life very miserable for them if they'd been allowed to stay here. What I knew about these kids was that they were the smart kids in the class, you know. They were interested in academics and they got good grades.
Did you ever, you mentioned World War II and the Japanese, what happened with the Japanese. Did you ever witness things that really brought home to you the question about race and a difference that existed maybe between you and others because you were white?
Not in the sense that we have it now. I think when you grow up with a lot of animals, and some of them are Holsteins, and some of them are Herefords, and some of them are Angus, and some of them are Charolais, you know, it doesn't seem to make as much difference to you. It didn't seem strange to me that people would be all different colors. It's just the way it was. And there were a lot of different colored animals around the place, but it depended on the individual animal.
Did you come across people who did not feel the way that you did about race?
When I got to Stanford, well, I didn't care about how other people felt when I was in Watsonville at school, because however I felt was the way that other people felt. I mean, I was a pretty bossy kid, I guess. I don't think so. Although my teachers kind of chuckled, but the teachers kept me well under control. But I liked them and I knew that they liked me, but they would sort of say, now, Diane, you know, and I knew not to push it. So that took care of that level. And then when I got to Stanford, I was so eager I wanted to do well. I wanted to learn this stuff. That's the reason you took the classes. Some of the classes you had to take. Well, I wanted to do in those because I just wanted to do well. I think that you are either someone who is always looking for the next adventure. I don't think you look for an answer. I never did anything thinking I was going to get, oh, once I get there, I'll know it all. I just knew that getting there would be fun. Getting there is what's the interesting part.
I think you've told me that your family built the church, All Saints in Watsonville. many, many years ago, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Well, I don't know whether they hammered nails, but a part of my family, my father's family, were very tried and true Episcopalians, Anglicans. My great grandmother came from Canada and was a Anglican. And when she came here, was married and I think established that church. My great great grandfather came here as assistant to Bishop Kipp, who was the
oh,
first bishop of California. At that time, it was all one diocese. He came here because his family were here having come for the gold, and he came to visit his uh, brothers who had come out to be gold seekers and who were, I think, moderately successful. And then he went back to go to continue his education. He's from Connecticut. And en route, he was befriended by a nice gentleman who fell ill and died. And my grandfather took care of him during that time and delivered his, I don't know whether they were ashes, but transferred his remains in some way to his family. And during the course of all that, it came to him that, he was intended to be a priest, that taking care of that relationship between the spiritual world and the world of the active person
mhm.
was where he felt his calling was. So he came back and was the assistant to the bishop and founded a lot of churches around
Mhm.
California. And my grandmother was a very devoted Episcopalian, and she raised her children to be good members of the church or recalcitrant members of the church. I think the boys all didn't mind filling out the blank if it was necessary, but they were not. I went into the church because I live way out in the country, and it was a way to get to town on the weekends because I could say I wanted to go to Sunday school. And so I could go in there, and Sunday school was fun because there were other kids, and I loved being out with my animals and in the ranch, but I liked being with kids too. So that was great. So I got to go in and stay in town with my cousins.
Since, a lot of our conversation has to do with, other, your impressions of other people and all of that, but I wanted to know what you thought about the church, in particular, in this case, the Episcopal Church. And did you find race to be an impediment, or was it a strengthening point within the church? How did you find race
Never thought
interacting?
about it.
I'm sorry.
Never thought about race in conjunction with the church whatsoever. All of my best friends, most of my best friends were, if they were Asian, they all were Buddhist. And that's fine. And if they were Anglos, they were usually Catholics, Roman Catholics, and that's fine. Then there were a few stray Presbyterians, and that's fine because they had great youth groups. And then they had a very few of us who were Episcopalians. It had liturgy.
Yeah.
It had things that you did, and you knew that you thought you were doing the right thing. And if you did the right thing, it was okay. I think that's why there were so many Catholics too. They didn't have to think a lot about it or argue it through. They just had to do what they thought was the right thing. Well, it's like eating. Nobody said, they teach you how to sit at the table and how hold your spoon and fork and give you the proper food or teach you what food to choose. And they don't get in, you don't get into a lot of elaborate discussions with little children about this. You feed them and you teach them how to feed themselves. I came in town to go to church because I like the service, and I like being in town for the weekend. I can't say that I was filled with a zeal to find Christ or something.
Don't worry, I won't tell anyone.
Oh, you can tell them all you want. It's never too late. I'm still there, but I never gave up.
Did you ever feel as you were progressing through life, getting your adulthood and then your children and grandchildren, did you ever think that race afforded you some privilege that because you're white that you might not have had otherwise?
I didn't feel it at the time. I certainly know it's true, but it wasn't just race. I grew up being as a very privileged person. I grew up very out in the country in a very simple life, very simple farm life, but I grew up with a very great sense of that I belonged to a family that was important to me, and that I was an important part of that family, and that nobody told me this, but I knew that there were expectations. And I think that, but I never felt overwhelmed by them. I didn't think, oh my God, I have to do all this because I'm a porter. But, I knew that my family who had been an early settler here, that they'd worked diligently, that they'd come around the horn. And I had a lot of lore about my family's development in this and history in this part of the world. And I was very proud of that. I never felt that I had to do and be anything other than who I wanted to be, because they'd all been scoundrels and scallywags or done well or whatever. They'd done what they wanted to do. But I grew up with an idea of autonomy, and that goes with a lot of responsibility. We always had people in the garden. I was brought up to be very grateful to the gardeners and to the people who helped us. It's a much more reciprocal kind of a relationship than I think people have now when they think that, well, they're getting paid. It is not about monetary payment. It's about whether you are dependent upon somebody else for your well-being, and whether they in turn, in some fashion, are dependent upon you. It's a sense of relationship that I find is lacking today. I think that we are categorized by our education, by our job, by our color. My friends were, we didn't have any Black people. Yes, we did. I had one Black friend who was my uncle's gentleman's gentleman, who was the cook and butler and factotum of the of the big house, the big quote mansion that we all went to, and ransom. And believe me, he was in charge. You didn't do anything, you know. When I went there, if I was lucky, I got to help ransom. And I was very good and passed very politely and made sure I said please and thank you and so forth, because I didn't want to be anything less for ransom's sake. To think that he was helping serve with me was very important to me. And the same way with the various and sundry little, at one time, Japanese, then they all went off and, well, they were shipped away, but they went to school and came back and were teaching everything. And all the people of multiple races that I grew up with, that I worked with as a child, and well, not so much later on, but I wanted to do my best because I wanted to be a full partner with them. Well, you cannot be a full partner with someone that you don't feel a sense of equality to.
You know, Diane, thank you for this time. You have so much wisdom and experience, and
Oh, yeah, well, I have a lot of experience, but I don't know what happened to the wisdom. It shot past.
oh, the wisdom
Just
is
like
really
this time
there.
has.
The wisdom is really there, and I really appreciate your time so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.